Hello, and on behalf of the UCLA Allen D. Leve Center for Jewish Studies, I'd like to welcome you to today's event, which highlights Stacey Ravel-Abarbanel's recent film, UnRaveling. And we will provide a link to her website where you can find more information about screening the film yourself from home. And finally, we would like to thank everyone for staying socially distant and intellectually engaged by joining us through these virtual events for the fall quarter. And by way of introduction to the film itself, I wanted to share a little bit about how Stacey and I came to know each other. I work in academia. Stacey works in the museum world and also in the film world. And while it's not uncommon, it's not a given that scholars and more cultural creative types can collaborate in such a way. And lucky for me, Stacey reached out to me in spring 2019, over 2 years ago now, when I was teaching a continuing education course at the Skirball Cultural Center in Los Angeles. And I was teaching a class for the first time called Jews of the US-Mexico Borderlands. And Stacey really kind of emails me out of the blue and letting me know that her family has a really deep fit with this topic that I was teaching about, and generously asked me if I would be interested in ever coming over to her house and kind of getting a firsthand look at these documents that reflect her family's own history living on the US side, but also traveling to the Mexican side of what we call the US-Mexico border region. And these are documents from over 100 years ago at this point. And I absolutely accepted Stacey's invitation. We had a cup of tea. We looked through an amazing family photo album, which you have seen or will see in the documentary itself. And now fast forward to early March of 2020, a time we all remember very well. I was living in Tucson, Arizona at this point for my own doctoral research, and Stacey and her film crew were traveling to Columbus, New Mexico to film much of what you see in the UnRaveling documentary. And again, generously, Stacey invited me to join the film crew for this really amazing adventure that we had over a weekend that was commemorating I can't do quick math, but over 100-year anniversary of Pancho Villa's raid on the town of Columbus, New Mexico, which you will be intimately informed about that event once you've seen the documentary. And I wanted to start with this story for a few reasons. I personally love how the story really reflects how histories are learned about and written about in a way that kind of demystifies what academics are doing. It's not necessarily scholars going into libraries all the time or going to these official institutional archives and digging through these really protected documents. Sometimes these histories are uncovered by sitting over a cup of tea and looking through a family photo album inside somebody's home. And the second part of why I wanted to share this story is that it's all about the collaborative nature of storytelling, right? Collaboration and building relationships with people is really at the essence of how we tell stories and also how stories are preserved over time. And that is a perfect segue into kind of my first question for Stacey, which is, right, you're telling this story in the documentary. It's a family story. It's a family history that has been kind of passed down over a few generations at this point, not untouched by each listener to the story, right? Each listener kind of projects their own interpretation onto the story that also kind of adds, but also colludes some of the meaning to it. And what we get as viewers is this really rich, subjective, but deeply unresolved family history. So I'm hoping you could tell us a little bit about how your research into unraveling kind of substantiated or complicated your understanding of this complicated family myth.
Absolutely. First, I just want to thank you so much, Max, for talking with me about the film. Our collaboration has enriched me so much. I've learned so much from you, and feel like it's a friendship now. And so thank you very much. And thank you also, of course, to the Leve Center for inviting us to have this talk and for screening the film for your audiences. So yes, I think for those of you who've seen the film, there's this moment where my brother and one of my cousins both sort of validate this idea that this very general sort of story that when Pancho Villa raided the United States, he somehow was looking for our grandfather, who was at that time a resident of Columbus, New Mexico. That's a story that we've all sort of just known our whole life. And I think you see in the film, a lot of my relatives say it's not like anybody ever sat us down and told this story. It was almost something that we just always knew. It was always there. And so we had this context for the fact that Villa raided the town of Columbus, New Mexico in 1916. Our grandfather and two of his brothers at that time, my two uncles, were residents of the town, and that there had been some sort of an arms deal that went bad, and Villa was for some reason mad at Sam Ravel, my grandfather, and went after him that night. And that was kind of it. So there wasn't really any broader understanding of why Sam was there in Columbus in the first place, or what other motives Villa and his army may have had for raiding the town. It was really just sort of this general kind of bizarre story. And over time, it just really called to me to do more research and figure out more what I could about my family's part in this, really major moment in U.S. history. It's often said that it's the only time in the 20th century that the continental United States was invaded by a major foreign army. So I was really interested in kind of diving into those gray areas.
And that's a perfect kind of setup for my follow-up question, which is, we're used to hearing stories, and particularly histories that have a really neat identifiable conclusion to them. And like I said at the beginning, this story does not. So maybe if you could share a little bit about what you learned about the value of telling histories and stories that don't have a neat ending to them.
Mm-hmm. Well, when I first started researching this, just cursorily, I read a lot of history books, and there are a lot of history books about the revolution, about the invasion of Columbus. And most often the Sam Ravel story is, it's a footnote or a paragraph here or there, he figures in most of those books. If I would always turn to the index first and see, well, it was a page here and a footnote there, or what have you. And when I started reading them, one thing that happened was I noticed that there were some things that were just wrong about and these were by noted historians in many cases. And, they could have been little things. One book in particular referred to Louis and Arthur Ravel as Sam's sons, but they're not his sons, they're his brothers. And so once I started seeing that, I guess a part of me felt like there was not really a definitive story here after all. And so it would be valuable for me to do my own research and try to figure out what I could. And I didn't really set out, I had no agenda. I wasn't trying to vindicate my grandfather or Villa for that matter, or blame them. I just wanted to understand more about how did this Jewish immigrant end up in the borderlands at the start of the Mexican Revolution? What might have been his motivations for going there? What was his life like? And if I did uncover some smoking gun that really, put a fine point on exactly why Villa was after my grandfather that night, absolutely, so be it. I would share that. I would share that right now if I knew that answer. But I came to have a really great appreciation for diving into the ambiguities of this story, because like much of life, there just isn't a super, there's not a bold underlying statement to describe what happened there. I think there's a constellation of things that came together. And certainly my grandfather played a part in that.
That's wonderful. I love the way that you're kind of pointing out the fallibility of what we consider official histories if it's written in a published book, and how your own family history and the memory of your family history is really able to enrich and correct what we often consider to be, the objective, capital T truth of historical documentation.
Right. And we even played with this on sort of an interpersonal family level, because I think, many of us can relate to the idea that your own family stories, you ask 3 different people in your family to recount a story, and they're going to recount it in 3 different ways. And that might even be all within the same generation. So specifically, there was a lore, a legend, I guess, about my uncle Arthur, who had a very harrowing experience the night of the raid, was roused from his bed by vistas and really captured by them and held captive as they took him through town, ostensibly looking for his older brother, my grandfather. And the family lore was that in the midst of a gun battle, Arthur was so close to death that bullets whizzed right past his head, and that actually he had his ear was damaged by gunfire. That's just the story we always knew about my Uncle Arthur. And you'll see moments in the film where I ask one of his grandchildren, my cousin Paula, and his grandnephew, my cousin Richard, and my sister about this. And there's a little bit of head scratching that goes on there, where they're looking at pictures and saying, well, his ear looks fine here. And then my sister says, oh, no, I absolutely remember seeing a notch in his ear. And in fact, Arthur himself self-reported that happened to him and that a bullet grazed his ear. And I found that in an article that was published in the 1950s in New Mexico Magazine. But we were very purposeful in including that in the film, because we felt it was a very relatable moment that families, that there's a bit of a squishy center on some of these stories that we tell about our lives and our family. So.
Super. I love that. It's very relatable, of just kind of seeing how one family member tells a story about themselves, and how that echoes to the relatives around them in different ways that both reflect and contradict the story at the center. So I want to move on to one of my favorite parts of this film, and I hope it will be interesting to our viewers, is the way that the documentary brings together American Jewish history, or U.S. Jewish history, and U.S.-Mexico border history in ways that really kind of expand our understanding of both of these camps of North American history. And particularly, I'm fascinated about how the documentary really complicates our really dominant notion of Jewish immigration geography, where Jewish immigration happens and has happened in the United States, and also how the border region, as part of that geography, that kind of less explored geography of Jewish migration, offers this kind of surprising or unique representation of Jewish manhood or Jewish masculinity, and also Jewishness as a religious practice, right? Jewish religiosity. How do you do Judaism as a religion in a place like Columbus, New Mexico in the 1910s and 1920s? So I'm hoping you could tell us a little bit more about how your grandfather's history sheds this really unique light on American Jewish history in ways that have not been heard before.
Yeah, absolutely. I think for most American Jews, when you talk about modern Jewish immigration, our minds naturally turn to this idea of, well, they came through Ellis Island, they settled in New York or in nearby big metropolitan areas, largely living and working amongst other Jews. So kind of an insular sort of, naturally an insular sort of experience. And that is not Sam Ravel's story, and that's not the story of any of the Ravels. So, and like several thousand other Jews, my grandfather came to this country directly from Europe through the port of Galveston. He had family in El Paso, and so he settled in 1905 in El Paso, Texas. He had 3 uncles who had preceded him to the United States and already set up their families and their businesses there. So he had the enormous assistance of the fact that he had family there already. And he did not live in a big metropolitan area and did not have a large Jewish community around him at all. And certainly whatever Jewish community he had became much smaller when he came to Columbus. He was Yiddish speaking, like all of our relatives from Eastern Europe would be. But when he came to this country, he had to learn not only English, but Spanish immediately because he was living and doing business on the border. So it's a very different story than the typical. And I certainly hoped to broaden people's perspectives on modern Jewish immigration to this country by telling this story.
Super. Thank you. Thank you. And I want to just pivot a little bit towards thinking, right? So now we know that Jews were immigrating to the border region at the turn of the 20th century. We know that Sam was not part of what we call the Galveston movement, which was a immigrant resettlement program financed by mostly German Jewish Americans in the early 20th century to resettle thousands. They had big aspirations, but it was only about 10,000 Eastern European Jewish immigrants into the American West. And the Galveston movement ran between 1907 and 1914. Sam was not officially part of that movement, but just preceded it. But I think that kind of opens up an interesting conversation for us to think about the kind of gendered representation that Sam presents in the film. As well as kind of how he did Jewishness in this space that was very, as you said, very sparsely populated in terms of Jewish residents. Mm-hmm. So maybe you could talk a little bit about gender and religion through Sam's history.
Yeah, absolutely. The most common thing that people tell me after they've seen the film is they go, wow, your grandfather was a badass, and they're surprised by that. You may have caught, if you saw the film, on his border crossing papers, it said his height and his weight. He was 5'2.5" and 180 pounds in that document. So not the physique maybe of a typical badass, but, we certainly see him, and especially in some of the pictures from the photo albums, as somebody who's really intrepid and bold and brave and able to negotiate lots of different kinds of circumstances, not somebody who lives in a very insular community, but somebody who 1 minute is speaking Yiddish and the next doing business in English, and then crossing the border for both work and pleasure. And in that moment, doing all of that, conversing in Spanish. So he comes across to me as a pretty dynamic, brave and intrepid person. And, I know that's kind of part of your research, I guess, you might better comment than me about how that perhaps plays against type of what Jewish manhood is about.
Sure, I can jump in. And this is actually, in case she's watching out there, this is wonderful research already done extensively by Sarah Imhoff and David Kaufman, kind of about what the American West more broadly offered in terms of not a person like Sam, not Sam's own understanding of his masculinity, but rather the German Jewish Americans who were financing resettlement programs like the Galveston movement, their understandings about what manhood and particularly Jewish masculinity needed to look like in order for Jews to acculturate into what we'd call Americanness. And of course, there are deeply racial ramifications for that term as well as gendered. Mm-hmm. So largely when we say the border region is offering this different type of masculinity for Jewish immigrants. That's really the imagination of German Jewish Americans projected onto Jewish immigrants, and certain reconfigurations of their identity as new arrivals to the United States that needed to be done to ensure Jewish inclusion socially, economically, and otherwise into this American project that was happening in the American West at the time. And I think what's really fascinating about just the audience response to your film is this shock of Sam's badassness, right? Why is that shocking to see a Jew like Sam? And I think it speaks a little bit to how this notion of what a Jewish man should look like or be like or act and where they should live, it's really been internalized, and we can see kind of these tropes about Jewish masculinity that were being articulated over 100 years ago. They still kind of swim in the waters of the Jewish American cultural imagination today.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, he was 20 years old when he came here and was tasked with doing whatever he could to bring all the rest of his siblings here. His parents never came to this country. So at the age of 20, his job was to come, make a living, get settled, and as he could, bring the rest of his siblings here. And he did. Louis, Arthur, and then many years later, his sister Dora and her husband and young child all came because my grandfather was able to make that happen for them. So those are some pretty big shoulders, it sounds to me, for sure. The question of his Jewishness, in one archive, I found a comment by one of his cousins from El Paso that said he was deeply religious and that in his years in El Paso, he never missed a Friday night in shul. The family belonged to B'nai Zion, which is an extant congregation in El Paso, conservative congregation in El Paso. But surely once he moved to Columbus, there was no synagogue. There were not a lot of Jewish families, but there were some, as we'll talk about, I think, later. I understand that for major Jewish holidays, he and his brothers went back to El Paso, where the uncles and their families were. So typically for high holidays and things like that, they would journey back to El Paso to be with family. But there's a really beautiful bit of Jewish history that we uncovered in Arthur's papers, which was once Villa raided the town, there was a big military buildup, a U.S. military buildup in response, as they readied the punitive expedition to attempt to go into Mexico and capture Villa. And amongst the thousands and thousands of soldiers who moved to Columbus, there were some Jewish troops, and Arthur commented in a memoir of sorts that they were really happy to find out there was this Jewish family in town. I read in another book that they used to keep their store open until 10 o'clock, which is pretty late for a small town, but it was just really a gathering space. And apparently these Jewish soldiers congregated at the Rabble Brothers store. And we found a picture with a bit of a notation written on it, I think by my uncle Arthur, that in 1917, so it's the fall now of 1917, the troops are still in Columbus. They're still pursuing Villa. Sam arranged for a Jewish military chaplain to come to Columbus and hold high holiday services for the Jewish soldiers and other Jews who were in the town at the time. And he also rented a hall and hired a cook and arranged for a Rosh Hashanah dinner. And the picture that we have, which is in the film, it shows 3 of these Jewish soldiers cleaning up after the meal. And there's a big pile of wine bottles in the front. If you have it's kind of fun to look for that, but you can see that. So that was kind of a nice moment. And I don't know this to be a fact, but in my mind, I always think that was probably the first and the last time that there were high holiday services in Columbus, New Mexico. So,
well, that is a fantastic bit of history because, for the scholars who have attended to what was going on in Columbus at this time, we do know that at the onset of the Mexican Revolution, after 1910, the United States sends, I believe it's about 20,000 troops to the border region broadly. And as you said, after Villa's raid, it's this kind of concentration and explosion of even more US troops at the border between New Mexico and Chihuahua. And that's kind of, we get the military large scale history there. And your family story really uncovers this, would have been a hidden story about kind of co-ethnic and co-religious kind of reunions that can happen in a place like Columbus, New Mexico, 1916, 1917.
Yeah.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
All right. So let's move on to my next question. It's kind of related to the previous one about how this expands Jewish American history and US-Mexico border history. But because of the methods you use, for lack of a better word, as a documentary filmmaker, the story is necessarily about the border region and specifically Columbus as it is in 2020. Right. So it's not just a history, but this is also a reflection of present day reality of the US side of the border. And I'm curious a little bit about what this process of making the film taught you about the border region that you felt was really important to translate over to your audience.
Mm-hmm. Well, I didn't grow up in the border like my dad and my uncles did. I grew up in the Bay Area in Northern California, but I did visit border towns probably more than most Jewish girls growing up in the Bay Area in the 70s and the 80s, because we had these family reunions and often they were in the Southwest. And so we had one in Tucson, and one of the family activities would be to get on a bus and go over to Nogales for the day. We had reunions in El Paso and had family there for many, many years. And always we'd go over to Juarez and enjoy a day over there, have a meal there. So I'm not entirely unfamiliar with border culture, having visited, fairly frequently growing up. The biggest thing that I noticed is that in general, when you mention the US-Mexico border, most minds immediately turn to it as a site of conflict. And without minimizing the very real conflicts that do exist in border communities and things like cartel violence and the like, the border is also a site of opportunity and a site of family and a site of community. It was when my grandfather lived there, and it still is today. And so one of the things that I think the film does a really good job in is highlighting the border as a place of community. You see it certainly in my grandfather's time, and the frequency with which he was going back and forth for work or for pleasure or what have you. But to me, one of the most poignant parts of the film comes towards the end, when you see one of the ways the local community in both Palomas, Mexico and Columbus, New Mexico commemorate the raid. For the past more than 20 years, it's been with something called the Cabalgata Binacional Vista, which is a binational equestrian cavalcade that takes place in the region and has every year since '99. And for that, hundreds of equestrians, both from Mexico and from the United States, ride up to the border. And there's this moment you see in the film where US Border Patrol pulls open this livestock gate, and the Mexican riders and the American riders come together and they process into town. And I found it really quite moving that for whatever happened there and however it's viewed today by people on both sides of the border, this event takes, a bloody battle and turns it into a festival of friendship. So that's something I'm really happy to be shining a light on.
Absolutely. And I think what the film and Sam's history particularly reminds audiences is, I think, how naturally integrated the space of the border region is. And it's actually very recent, really within well under 100 years ago, that these physical barricades have been, put to divide the United States from Mexico, right? Part of the fencing started going in maybe at the turn of the 20th century, but I believe the majority starts going in the 1970s. Mm-hmm. And when we hear a little bit more about Sam's life and just kind of the fluidity with which he experienced the border region, that's one reminder, right, of these imposed barriers that they are not natural to the space, right? And we see this reflected absolutely through the cabalgata and this really unique collaboration and union between Mexican nationals and Mexican Americans that happens in Columbus every year.
Yes, and of course we talk as well. I do a quick interview with someone on horseback, and he turns out to have been, he's ridden over from Mexico with the Mexican riders, and he shares with us that he was born in the United States, but he spent most of his life working for American companies in Mexico. And so he lives on both sides. That's what he says, that he is a citizen and a community member of both sides of the border. And I think that is not atypical. So,
absolutely. All right. So the next question I want to present you with is a little bit about how your toolkit that you came into this project with, particularly your experience working with museums, and how, if at all, did that impact, I guess, your role in the film itself, your role as a researcher of the story? Yeah, give us a little bit of insight into how museum work maybe lent itself to making documentary film.
Sure. I worked on staff at museums for many years, first at the Getty, and then for many years at UCLA's Fowler Museum. So UCLA is close to my heart for that reason, for sure. And not as a curator, I still work as a consultant for museums and cultural organizations. But what I would say is all those years working on exhibitions and helping tell those stories out into the world and amplify exhibitions so that people will come and experience them has taught me the value of narrative storytelling, and that it's a really compelling way for audiences to connect to history and to contemporary life is by telling a narrative. So when I first, initially I wrote an essay about this history that was published in August of 2019 in Tablet magazine. And once it was published, I was speaking with Jeff Swimmer, who is the director of this film and a personal friend. And I said, I really think we should make a documentary about this. Jeff is a documentary filmmaker and the head of the doc department at Chapman University. So he's a good friend to have if you want to make a documentary film. And I said, I think we should make a documentary about my grandfather and Pancho Villa. And Jeff said, no, you want to make a documentary about your journey to figure out what happened between your grandfather and Pancho Villa. And I think he was right on the money, of course. That was a great way to see this, because then it's this my personal journey. And I think a journey a lot of other people maybe have either gone on or want to. They maybe have a relative, somewhere on their family tree that they've wondered about. So it was a really a good way to make that connection. It's not something that I probably wouldn't have centered myself in this project were it not for Jeff's insistence and that of the other producers of the film as well, who were really quite sure that that was the way to go with it. And now in hindsight, I see that, centering it on my personal exploration was a really good idea. And the one thing about having a personal narrative be sort of the structure of a story like this is I feel like we were able to take some of these other themes that are really important to me about the border itself and expanding people's understanding of it, and about modern Jewish immigration to this country and expanding people's conceptions of that as well. And even about how we tell our stories in general. That's something that really interests me. And I think probably from all my years of working in museums, we were able to really weave all that in because we were centering it on my personal narrative. So I think that ends up being kind of, maybe we cleverly have woven in some of these other stories, but it holds together, I think, because of the personal narrative. So
I love that. And again, you set me up perfectly. You're speaking about taking other histories and pieces of the puzzle to weave in to enrich your family narrative. As a historian, I'm endlessly, as are most historians, really curious about where people find their sources and where do you find the evidence to tell and substantiate a history like this. And I'm thinking about, the mania that we have around detective novels and true crime podcasts. We know that the process of uncovering sources is in and of itself a big part of the story that people love to hear about. So could you share a little bit about where this research process took you? If you ever hit any obstacles or dead ends, how did you pivot in those moments? Did it lead you to any really surprising places?
sure. Yeah, I will say that because this flashpoint on March 9th, 1916 was such an important event in the history of North America, really, there's been a lot written about it. So the first thing I did, as I mentioned, was I read a lot of history books, books about Pancho Villa and about American intervention in Mexico and about the history of the region. And like I said, very often there'd be, snippets here and there about my grandfather. And then I started to access some scholarly archives as well. The first one, my cousin Jeff Ravel, who also appears in the film, is a historian professionally. He's at MIT. His area is not this region. It's like 17th to 19th century French history. But many years ago, about 20 years ago, he was visiting Los Angeles, and he said, there's actually a local archive at the Huntington that has some papers that deal with the Ravel story. So if you ever want to check it out, here's the citation and here's the information. And I held on to that little scrap of paper for a long time before I finally decided to dive into this story. But once I did, it was the first archive that I accessed. It's at the Huntington Library, and those are the papers of Senator Albert Fall, who was one of the first senators of New Mexico. And in his papers are some correspondences with Sam Ravel. Not entirely about the raid, but many of them are. The citizens of the town applied for restitution from the US government. So there's papers involving letters back and forth and affidavits about what happened and itemizing what their losses were. But there were other times as well that Sam got into some sticky situations in Mexico and called on his senator for help, and he helped him. So that was the first major archive that I accessed. My cousin Jeff was also around the same time going through the personal papers and documents of his grandfather, Arthur, my uncle. So there were some goodies in that personal family collection that we found. I have some details from the University of Arizona Special Collections, which is the Southwest Jewish Archive. The University of Texas at El Paso, I discovered, holds these wonderful oral histories that were done in the early 1960s by a guy named Bill McGaw, who also is not a professional historian. Interestingly, he was the publisher of the El Paso Times, I think it's called, the El Paso newspaper, but also was just passionate about the history of the Southwest. And so presciently in the 1960s, he went around and interviewed people who were still alive who had experienced the raid firsthand. And I think if anyone who's seen the film will know that was really quite a moment for me, a kind of gold for the film, I think, when we located these audio files, because literally I clicked a link and my uncles were talking to me through my computer. And that was, all of a sudden these Yiddish voices, in the case of, I don't really remember my Uncle Louis, but Arthur I do, and I heard his voice. He's been gone since the 70s. And that was really a great moment, and there was some really good material there. And then some of the photographs were accessed through the Library of Congress, and the Rosenberg Library at University of California at Riverside has a good photography collection, and some of those great pictures of Pancho Villa came from that. So archives all over the country, really. Oh, and then, yes, Columbus, right. So the weekend that we spent in early 2020 in Columbus, one of the things that you and I did together actually was popped into the archive that's part of the Columbus Historical Society. Those documents were largely collected by a guy named Richard Dean, who died a few years ago. And they were formerly in his home, I believe. And only recently, when we were there, had been moved into that outbuilding that's at the local historical society. But I found some good stuff in there, including records of other times, other instances that I was not aware of. One just 4 months after the raid, where Sam got into some trouble on the border again. This time was accused of smuggling goods into Mexico without proper paperwork for bringing things across. He ended up, that all got washed off and it was fine, but there is this documentation, and what it, again, really kind of shed a light on about him was, here it is, it's 4 months after the raid. He knows Pancho Villa has come into town to try to kill him. He's terrorized his brothers, and he's tried to destroy, and his businesses were partially destroyed by the raid. And there it is 4 months later, and he's going back across the border again, this time with some whiskey and some ammunition and weapons. Not sure for what purpose, but again, I felt, wow, intrepid person. So.
And what that makes me think about is it's also this really fascinating angle at kind of the history of how surveillance is starting to be institutionalized at the US-Mexico border. So the implementation of a system of visa and passport checks really begins in 1921 and is expanded after 1924. But we see we're able to access part of Sam's history because of these border crossing violations that you thankfully were able to get your hands on. Mm-hmm. And so we kind of have this amazing story about all of the exhaustive archival work that you have done. I think you deserve a dissertation or doctoral degree just for all of that. But also part of the story was, or part of your research, and as we call it, data collection, was you actually physically being in Columbus and kind of witnessing the way that this town and the people who live there on both sides of the border, how they remember this event. So maybe you could speak a little bit to the importance of, I guess, getting your body into a place as part of documenting your history.
Yeah. Columbus and Palomas, that region is still very much, I'd say the identity of that region is still very much defined by this raid that happened more than 100 years ago. And that becomes evident in lots of ways when you're there. One, and it's a controversial way, is that there's a state park in Columbus with a campground and a historic, like a visitor center, et cetera. And it was, I believe, instituted in the 50s. And is called Pancho Villa State Park. This is in New Mexico. The state park is called Pancho Villa State Park. And some people balk at that. Why would there be a state park named after somebody who invaded the town and killed Americans there? There was just an op-ed about this 2 weeks ago in one of the Santa Fe newspapers. So it still is a subject that is interesting to people. So there's Pancho Villa State Park, and there's shops, et cetera, that you will see, motels named after Villa, et cetera. But by far, I think for me, the biggest thing was being able to be there during the Cabalgata and see the enormous number of people who turn out on both sides of the border every year to commemorate the raid. We, as you see in the film, went on the Friday night before the cabalgata over to Palomas, because we had heard that there was a big party in town to honor all the riders. We're talking hundreds of horseback riders who every year spend almost 14 days following Villa's hoofsteps up to the border. So they travel on horseback and they get hospitality in local communities. And then eventually they arrive in Palomas. And, the town of Palomas, I think, is only about 4,000 or 5,000 people. It felt to me that there were 1,000 people at that party on Friday night that we went to. It was just this enormous event with music and food, and all the riders got certificates commemorating their ride. And then the next morning they cross over the border and spend the day in the village of Columbus, and there's a party in the village. So certainly, I don't think I could have understood the way that the story of Villa's raid is embedded in those communities without being there. But another thing happened sort of fortuitously during our time there. We were ready to leave on Sunday morning, and we had a lot of time before our flight was leaving in El Paso. And so the crew I was with, I said, well, let me go see if I can visit my grandfather's grave. I had never been there before. I had tried once before and couldn't get on to the cemetery grounds in El Paso where Sam is buried. And so kind of on a lark, because we had more time, we decided to go there. And, I don't want to spoil too much of what happens in the film, but I will say that we made it, I found it, and I was surprised myself by what an emotional experience that was for me, because I never knew my grandfather. He died when my own father was just, 8 years old. So to have a deeply emotional experience and be moved to tears at the gravesite of someone who I never knew, I thought a lot about how that could happen, and I think that his tombstone was like a literal touchstone to me. Because I never knew him, there are so few things that I can lay my hands on that I can connect to him as a place. And having spent 3 days in Columbus on the ground where he lived, talking to people about the importance of that flashpoint in North American history, and then coming to his grave, I think that's why I became really overcome. And I will say that, like, on some level, I feel like I know him now. And that's a really great thing to have accomplished. So
that I think that a lot of folks watching this might be able to connect to that. Having ancestors who we've never met in person, they leave traces of themselves for us to go find, and you just got to go physically, you got to go look for them. Thank you for sharing that.
Sure.
All right, and we're getting towards our last question, actually, and we'll bring it back home to the Alan D. Leve Center. In fact, the family history you tell in UnRaveling actually intersects with the history of the Leve family. And maybe if you could talk a little bit about this connection, because it is part of U.S. Jewish history that, as we've been saying, is really underdocumented.
Yeah, this is really a stunning piece of Jewish geography, I think. But in August 2019, when Tablet published my essay about this history, Alan Leve, I believe, saw the essay. Someone must have sent it to him. And because of our mutual connections at UCLA and my many years of working at UCLA and knowing people at the center, we were able to meet each other. And Alan and I had a really wonderful lunch together when he shared that his mother and her siblings and his grandparents also lived in Columbus, New Mexico. And amongst the things that he pulled out for me that day was a page of the 1920s census for Columbus, New Mexico. And, it was a sheet that listed maybe 30 or 40 different names. I'm not sure, how long those documents are. At the top was the Schoenfeld family, which is his mother's family. And it says that they're Jewish on there. And then it goes through, you go all the way down the page. There's nobody else Jewish listed on the page. At the very, very bottom of the page, there's two more Jewish residents, and they are my grandfather, Sam Ravel, and my grandmother, who had by then moved there, Anna Block Ravel. So they lived on the same block of town in Columbus. And Alan had heard that, that they knew each other quite well. In fact, he had even heard that one of the Ravel brothers sort of courted his mother in Columbus. And I didn't know anything about that until I got into Arthur's papers through my cousin Jeff. And in it, there were two pictures of, she's named in pencil, it's written above her name, Yetta Schoenfeld. I think Yetta was her Yiddish name. That's Alan's mother. And there's one picture of her standing with my grandmother, Anna, and another with my grandmother and my uncle, Arthur Ravel. And then in Arthur's memoir, he actually mentions that he did have sort of a courtship with her as teens in Columbus, and that many years later he went to Denver and looked her up, and they had both, married other people and had families with other people, but they absolutely knew each other in Columbus, New Mexico, and that was a really amazing connection to be able to make.
We love to hear that. I think when you and I were discussing a little bit about these connections earlier, what comes to mind to me is the kind of absurdity of thinking about asking somebody who also has, let's say, Jewish ancestry that we can trace back to Brooklyn, New York, for example. You would never ask, "Oh, did you know my uncle Saul?" You can't ask those questions in a place where there's a real demographic density of Jewish immigrants or Jewish Americans, but you can ask these questions when you're tracing Jewish history in a place like Columbus, New Mexico, in the 1910s.
Yeah.
So we're thrilled to hear a little bit more about that connection.
Yeah, it was sweet.
All right. And that does it for us. Thank you for joining Stacey and I in conversation about the wonderful documentary film UnRaveling. Thank you for joining the Leve Center today. And I think that's all I have to say.
Thank you, Max. And thank you, Leve Center. Appreciate it.